Joining us now to talk about this somber anniversary is History Professor Andres Kasekamp from the University of Toronto. Professor, 1 year on, do you think the dynamics of this war have changed? What is Russia's focus now?
Russia's focus remains the same, unfortunately. Russia has not changed its war aims and shows no sign of backing down, no sign of admitting its mistakes. Putin still claims that everything is going according to plan, which initially was supposed to be a regime change and takeover within 3 or 4 days. So after all these tremendous losses that the Russians have suffered and the Ukrainians have suffered, there's no indication that Russia has changed course, even though the sanctions have been ramped up and are beginning to bite. The Russians still are resilient. And as long as the war is taking place on the territory of Ukraine, then the Russians really aren't feeling the impact of it. And that's partly because, of course, the Western allies, first and foremost the US, have forbidden the Ukrainians to use their equipment to actually attack launch sites in Russia, which would be the complete sort of legitimate and justified self-defense that Ukraine would need to actually change the dynamics in the war.
More countries, including Canada, announcing more aid to Ukraine today. What kind of help do you think Ukraine needs? What would be the most beneficial to them at this point?
Well, the West has been helping Ukraine all along, and the problem is that it's been kind of reactive, that this aid hasn't come in advance of when Ukraine would actually need it, but it's always kind of lagging behind in reaction to events like these tanks, which Canada announced today, 4 more Leopard 2 tanks. This is something that Ukraine could have used already back in the fall. And now they're going to be perhaps on the battlefield only in the spring. And the same is the next conversation about perhaps giving Ukrainians also Western fighter planes, which they could use, but it takes time to not only transfer the equipment, but to train the pilots and the maintenance crews, etc. So it's wonderful that we're ramping up this assistance, but we might not have needed to do as much had we given this aid to begin with. This kind of always lagging behind has really just given Russia sort of a free hand to escalate the situation, because the West has been in a situation where it's basically self-deterring itself out of this fear of escalation. And it's exactly what Putin and the Kremlin is playing at.
Do you think this war will continue to drag on? Is there any end in sight? And what can we expect in the coming months?
There doesn't appear to be an end in sight at the moment, unfortunately. The good news, of course, is that Ukraine has proven to be resilient and has defended itself. But in order to go on the offensive, to clear its territory of the invader, then it needs more arms and equipment, and different types of equipment and weapons that can reach a further distance. Like I was saying earlier about airplanes and the tanks that are only now coming from the West onto the battlefield. So basically, of course, the war can end. Putin can end it immediately, right? That's the whole paradox in this, that Russia is the one who's invaded. Russia could say tomorrow that, okay, we'll go home. We'll withdraw behind the border. The war's over. But if Ukraine gives up, then Ukraine is lost and the aggressor has won.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
My pleasure.